Hello, everyone, and welcome to the many facets of accessibility in technical communication. My name is Sarah O'Keefe. I'll be moderating today, and we have Shar James Tanny on the line to present. A couple of quick things before we get started. We are recording the webcast, and we will make that recording available to you and to the general public within typically about 24 hours after the event. If you have questions for our presenter, please locate the questions area in GoToWebinar. We're taking questions that way. So you can type in your question and we will tackle those toward the end of the webcast. We'll leave probably about 15 minutes for any questions that you might have. And with that, I want to introduce you to Shar James Tanny. Shar has been in this industry as a technical communicator for more than 30 years at this point, and has worked with all sorts of interesting and high-profile clients, including places like Honda and Red Hat and Toshiba. But maybe more importantly for our purposes, she is sought after worldwide to speak on topics, especially including accessibility and help authoring and social media. So in addition to all of that, on the side, she's the primary coordinator for the Boston Accessibility Unconference, works on the Boston Accessibility Group, is an expert with the W3C HTML working group, and has been a Microsoft MVP since 2002. It is not clear to me when she sleeps, as she's also written a few books and some other craziness. And Shar and I have been friends for quite a long time, and I am so happy that you're here to talk about this really important topic. So Shar, are you with us over there?
I'm here.
Yay, there you are. Okay, well, I will pass it off to you. Thanks again for coming. And without further ado, Shar James Tanny on accessibility. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, parent by text message. Teenagers hate talking on the phone. Teenagers love to text. This is their preferred method of communication these days, even with friends who are sitting in the same room, even with friends who are in their backyard, they're sitting in a group in a backyard. My son probably sends and receives between 1,500 to 2,500 texts a month. And most of them have, 8 characters top. And yes, we do have an unlimited plan. Teenagers don't like face-to-face. That much hasn't changed in all these years. And the fact is, I travel sometimes a lot. And when I travel to different time zones, I love my son dearly, but I really don't want to talk to him at 4 a.m. On the other hand, he can send me a text at 4 a.m. I will get it when I wake up, and I can reply, and he'll get it when he's allowed to use his phone. In case you don't have any teenagers for a frame of reference, right now, at least in this area, in order, the way they like to communicate is by text, by Twitter. Instagram, Vine, and Facebook are all sort of intermingled, although Instagram tends to be winning. And the only time this order will change is if it's an emergency, and then I get a phone call. It all comes down to knowing your audience. Your teenager is one of your audiences. You have to know how to deal with them, or you're not going to be able to communicate. This is the same for all audiences. What tends to happen is that we end up siloing our audiences. We end up saying to one group, okay, we will make sure we provide exactly the information you need because you need it in English. And then maybe we'll go through it and go, oh, wait a minute, we need to be able to translate it, so let's make changes. Oh, we need to have good search engine optimization. Let's make another change. Accessibility usually ends up at the end. But this really cute graphic, which I cannot find attribution for anywhere, says, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. And the fact is, of all the animals here, the monkey's the only one who's going to actually be able to succeed. Penguins, elephants, goldfish, seals, and dogs or wolves really don't do a good job climbing a tree. We have to make sure that our content isn't, quote, a fair exam. It has to be good for everybody. When it is not good for everybody, it's like we're putting a big keep out sign on our content. I've been watching MasterChef, the UK version, professional, and they all went, the chefs in one of their final things went to the fat duck. And I'm watching TV and I'm going, wow, what awesome looking food. I wonder how much it costs. I'm using the Nexus 7. I Google it. I get to their website where I get this nice little message that says, sorry, you've got to install Flash. The whole Fat Duck website is in Flash. So I had to wait till I got back to my computer to do it. That's a keep out sign for anybody who would like information. And restaurants do tend to be the biggest problem when it comes to things like websites that are available to everyone, not just from an accessibility standpoint, but from an anything standpoint. When you're traveling and you want to check out restaurants, if you can't get the menu on your phone, then you don't know what your options are. You know, might say it's a great place to go, but maybe you've got dietary restrictions, or maybe you want to make sure that your group can get in there, or maybe you've got somebody with a wheelchair and you need to make sure they can get into the restaurant to begin with. What we want to be able to do is create, is to design, develop, and deliver information that is always available to our audience. Part of the issue today is we don't always know who our audience is. We used to have a really tight focus. We used to know exactly. We were writing for administrators using this specific application. We knew how they were going to access the information, probably print. These days, because of blogging and websites and online documentation and Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter, our audiences are global. We don't know always if English is their first language. We don't know what issues they might have in trying to access what we're trying to provide. When we talk about accessibility, we are keying in on different types of disabilities that we want to make sure we account for. Those include sensory, people with vision issues who might be blind or low vision or colorblind, also known as color deficiency. They might have physical disabilities. They could be in a wheelchair. They could have a broken arm. Disabilities are not always permanent. A broken arm is a temporary disability. So is somebody on crutches, where all of a sudden their world has to change while they go through the healing process. There's cognitive issues, there's intellectual issues, and one that isn't thought about a lot, but it does exist, is a situational disability. A couple of months ago, my husband was driving home from Rhode Island at like 11 o'clock at night when the car overheated. And he was being followed by a friend of his who said the friend could give him my husband a ride home. So they pulled into a parking lot, dropped off my car, and then his friend brought my husband home. So he's calling me and telling me this, and my first thought is you can't just leave a car in a parking lot. You'll get towed. So I Googled the city, and I grabbed the first phone number that came up, and I had a lovely conversation with an officer in Mansfield, Texas. Situational disability, 11 at night, I'm tired, I'm panicky, I'm worried, and I didn't pay attention. In fact, I even noticed the area code was wrong, but area codes change. Massachusetts has had 3 area code changes since I've lived here, and we're talking about another one. And I just went, oh, maybe that one already went through. And so I called Texas, where the extremely nice, because he didn't know why he kept getting these phone calls, but there's like 12 Mansfields in the United States, and his number comes up first every time somebody searches. So situational disabilities are something else. It would have helped if they had, big words that said Mansfield, Texas, and I would have kept looking for Massachusetts because I knew where my car was. What we want to try and aim for are the guidelines from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines known as POUR. These are principles that have been written to help accommodate everybody. POUR means that your information must be perceivable. People must be able to recognize the information no matter how they access it. Operable. People must be able to use whatever interface is provided, whether they use a mouse or a screen reader or a tip and puff system or a keyboard, if they're on a phone, if they're on a computer, if they're on a desktop computer, if they're on a laptop. It has to be able to be operated. Understandable. People must be able to understand the information. It's awesome to use big words and multi-syllabic words and really complicated words because we know them, but it doesn't help if our audience can't understand them. My mother just got a Windows 8 system, and so I told her to go check out David Pogue's book because I like David Pogue's writing, and I thought that would be a good way for her to learn about Windows 8. And she called me this morning to say she went and she checked it out, and she couldn't understand anything he was saying. So it has to be understandable. I got to find a different book for my mother, obviously. And it has to be robust. People have to be able to access the information in whatever way they need to be able to access it. And people have different requirements as far as access goes. we have, as technical communicators, sort of a leg up on many other professions because much of what we do already addresses some best practices. For example, if you use structured authoring, you're already using headings correctly. The key here is to make sure that you don't manually format text so that it looks like a heading. We know that people skim. We know that people will bounce over headings and look for the one that they think they're interested in. And this is really important for people with cognitive issues who need the consistency of the font size and what a heading looks like so that they know they're hitting the right information. But without tags, headings aren't recognized by assistive technology. For example, on the left is a heading list from JAWS, which is a screen reader. When somebody is using JAWS, they can just hit Insert F6, and it'll bring up an entire list of headings for the whole document. They can then navigate through the headings the same as somebody who can look at them and skim them. On the right is a heading list from the New York Times. It's actually from several months ago. But I got this with a Firefox plugin called FANGS, F-A-N-G-S. It's a different way of getting it. You don't have, in other words, you don't have to have a screen reader. FANGS is basically a way to mimic what a screen reader, what the screen reader functionality would be without having to try and use a screen reader. What you'll notice, of course, I didn't pick the best file for the JAWS test, but you can see that they're all heading level 2. However, New York Times, and this hasn't changed, I looked at it this morning, they start with heading level 6s, they jump to 2, they jump to 6, they jump to 3, they jump to 6, they jump to 4. There isn't a lot of consistency in the heading structure of the New York Times webpage. This makes it harder for people to navigate through. Do make sure when you're writing headings that you want them to be more specific, you want them to be self-explanatory, and you should use heading types in sequential order, and you should have at least 2 headings per level. You also want to work on your content itself. This is obviously an older screenshot. This is from the last Olympics. You want to keep your sentences shorter than 25 words. It's not as easy sometimes as it sounds, especially if you're used to writing really, really, really long sentences. But a sentence with 50 or 60 or 70 words, while understandable to some people, is not understandable to all. Even I have trouble with really long sentences. I have to go back and reread the beginning sometimes to make sure I haven't missed something along the way, because long sentences are harder to understand than short sentences. You do want to vary the sentence length, because otherwise it's going to sound sort of stilted. It's going to be, you know, the Dick and Jane series, which is fine when you're in first grade and learning how to read, but not so awesome when you're older. By using shorter sentences of different lengths, it helps carry the readers through the content. And you want to keep your paragraph to 1 to 3 sentences. In print, that's a relatively short paragraph. But on a mobile phone or different devices, these paragraphs end up appearing much longer. And if you were to, the screenshot on the left shows a web page on a mobile phone, and you can see how much text there is. If you enlarge it, you're going to have some paragraphs that actually fill the screen. So now we've lost the advantage of white space. Way back in the old days, and any of you who were writing back in the 70s and 80s know this, the system was use passive voice in third person. God forbid we ever use the word you. The problem is it removes the user from the action, and it makes it much harder for users and people to understand concepts and instructions. You want to use active voice and present tense whenever possible. Some sentences have to be passive. Some things happened in the past, but you don't want to change the action of the sentence to passive. You want to use the second person. You want to use you. Sometimes it can be omitted. You can say check the whatever option. That's fine. You don't have to say you check the whatever option. Try to avoid future tense like will and shall. A lot of people when they're writing are thinking of the fact that the user will be seeing this in the future, and so they write that way. But when the person is reading the content, they're in the here and now. You want to pretend they're sitting right next to you as you're writing. If you want to do a quick check for Passive voice. This came from Twitter from a tweet by Rebecca Johnson. Try adding by zombies after the verb. If you can add it, then you've got passive voice. The screen is displayed by zombies. Therefore, it's passive. The information requested by zombies should be filed with the application. So you want to change the sentences around to make it as active voice as possible. You want to watch your vocabulary. Again, we want to use the best word, but you want to use it consistently. I can remember talking to somebody who was sort of new to this. I was doing a consulting job for somebody, and she said, but I want to be creative. I want to be exciting. I don't want them to get bored. They won't get bored. They will actually be able to follow your instructions. This is not a novel. This isn't something you're going to find up on Goodreads. You want to keep everything consistent. If you want them to select run, then they should select it always. If you want to use choose, fine, but they choose always. They always press or they always hit. You just want to make sure that you are very, very consistent in your vocabulary. Now, this helps in numerous ways. It helps if you are sending your stuff for translation. It helps people with cognitive disabilities. And it just makes it easier to read by anybody. And I just decided to hit the wrong key. Don't look. Don't go. Make sure you use lists. You want to, instead of using long paragraphs with lots of comma delimited terms and phrases, use lists. But do make sure you format them correctly. I like this screenshot because it's basically a numbered list. It should be a bulleted list. It doesn't matter what order those three things are that they don't have. Numbered lists are for things that must be followed in order. And please, and I've had people push back on this one, but you should never have a list with just one item. If there's a list, there should be more than one. If you have to have a list with one item, don't use just a regular bullet that you use for multi-item lists. Come up with a special character or something. But typically, one item can be melded into the previous sentence. The only time I've seen where it really couldn't be is if you're trying to make a consistent formatting and layout through a document where you've got something that really only has one option and you need to explain it. You just want to do something different so that it stands out as one item. Some other things we do are also easy tasks. This is for formatting. And yes, the whole idea of this graphic is low-hanging fruit, which is used a lot. People will attack the low-hanging fruit. The low-hanging fruit doesn't really translate well for anything, not for translation, not for people with cognitive issues. You want to make sure you use the best words. So I use the picture, but I changed the term. Do make sure you use left-aligned text. Write justified text. If you're not careful, depending on how many words are in the sentence and how it does it, can actually create kind of what looks like rivers through the content. And that's really hard for dyslexics to read. Because of the proportional spacing between the words in justified text, it can also be harder on your eyes, even if you're not dyslexic, because your eyes have to work harder because now the gap between words has changed. And the way people read, we don't read actually every word. We kind of skip over some. Your brain fills in the holes, and it's harder to do that if the text is justified. Do make sure that you use good color contrast. This is from a vision simulator. Color contrast makes text and images easier to read and comprehend. WCAG 2, the web content, sorry, my husband will get that in a second, hopefully quickly. WCAG suggests a minimum ratio of 3:1 for large text and 4.5:1 for other text and images. Once you start working with color contrast, you're going to be able to look at something and realize if it's good or not. This graphic is actually from a simulator where it starts with one picture, and what I did was I tried out all the different deficiencies and then screenshot just different portions of it so that you could see it's all the same picture, but this is what it looks like to somebody with that specific deficiency. Now, one thing to realize when it comes to color blindness, color deficiency, people who have a color deficiency don't really realize it. were born with it. They grew up with it. Their brain has made different associations. So while we look at this and go, whoa, like that upper right where it's sort of green instead of being orange, look, it doesn't look that way to them. My husband is colorblind. I'm one of those here, if he's not. He knows if I'm wearing red or if I'm wearing blue, if I'm wearing purple. What he doesn't know sometimes is if certain colors, especially in his case neons and pastels, if they're next to one another, he can't actually delineate between them. They all sort of end up being a color to him. So you want to make sure that you have good color contrast. And there's all sorts of checkers available. I use a Firefox plugin, and I have Firefox turned up. So if anybody wants it, I will have to look it up. But basically, I can either check a website by just saying I want to check this text, and it'll give me the foreground and background colors. Or I just finished a major job making an Excel file accessible, and I was able to put in color codes until I got codes that met the guidelines, and then I used those color codes in the Excel file. Black and white on black have the maximum color contrast, but it's actually not the best if you want to reach the largest number of people. Dyslexics actually find yellow on blue easiest to read, which also has, believe it or not, a decent color contrast. But most people don't want to design sites that use just yellow text on a blue background. What you can do to help all users is tone down. If you're using black on white, tone down the white. Don't use the color code FFF. Bring it down EEE, GGG. It just sort of blends it out a little bit, and it makes it easier. The other thing to be aware of is that websites aren't going to look the same in every browser, on every system, on every device. It depends on the settings. I have 2 identical monitors, and no matter what I've been able to do, I don't actually have the matching color settings on them. So one ends up being a little darker than the other. I have to drag browser windows across to try and see things and make sure that I'm doing well. But then on the other hand, it gives me the ability to kind of see what would happen if somebody had maybe some sort of a visual issue where things appear darker. You do want to watch out for that. You also need to be able to design your content so that it can be resized up to 200% without adding horizontal scroll bars. A lot of folks, a lot of websites fail this. And if you've ever tried to read a PDF on your mobile phone, that's a huge fail. You know, as you end up trying to scroll back and you swipe back and forth and up and down trying to read content. Basically, you need a responsive design which will use a fluid or proportional grid so that when content resizes, it stays within its boundary. This screenshot shows, I mean, I didn't change the monitor or the browser window size at all. The top upper picture is at 100%, the bottom is at 200%, and I did throw a horizontal scroll bar. People with low vision need this. In fact, a lot of times people with really low vision will use a magnifier, which means that it's almost like putting a magnifying glass up over the monitor and then moving the width of the magnifying glass to read content. So if they have to do that and do a horizontal scroll bar, it becomes more frustrating than it's worth, depending on your content. And some other things you can do to create accessible content involve techniques. And these might be things that aren't necessarily something we're usually familiar with, we don't always think about, but it's something that we need to think about. One is making sure that whatever it is you're doing is accessible by the keyboard. You should be able to use the tab key on a web page to go from link to link to link. You should be able to use the tab key and arrow keys to navigate through menus. There should be keyboard shortcuts so that you can jump around the page and get to different items. If you want to do text, just pretend your mouse doesn't work, which if your batteries have ever died, that has happened. And before you can get batteries in, if you're trying to do something, you might switch to using the keyboard. Just hit Tab. We use Alt-Tab on a Windows system to change between applications that are open, but you can also use Tab just to navigate through and around. Try it for a little while. You can give it 10 minutes and just see how well you can do. The links, I guess, will be available with the screenshot. I can come back and click them. I think we're going to have enough time. But These are just 5 different examples going from nothing through, it has a caption, it has a transcript, it has video description, and it has sign language interpretation. So the It Gets Better, the first link, is gorgeous. The video is beautiful. The sound is magnificent. And if you have your sound turned off, you have absolutely no idea what's going on. The NASA video uses captions, which means that someone who is deaf or has hearing issues or who is watching this in an office where they can't have their sound on and doesn't have headphones can actually understand what's going on because they can read the captions as the video plays. The city government is very good at providing transcripts to all the videos they put out. Hamlet is fascinating. It's the one that uses description, video description. This further enhances the video by filling in the gap. Basically, it's like having somebody read a script to whoever is listening. This is typically helped out mostly people who are blind because it describes the action that's taking place. And then the last one, the IRS tax tip, is one of many videos that use American Sign Language to also provide instructions. You can see sign language videos up on YouTube. There's more than 40,000. And the IRS actually has quite a few that they use to provide tax information. Make sure you don't override or get rid of the CSS attribute focus if you are creating online content. What focus does is what you see in this suckerfish example. As people tab through the link they are on highlights. This is how people know which link they are focused on if they are using the keyboard and they can see. People who are blind have used the keyboard to navigate. The screen reader will tell them which link has the focus. Back years ago, people, and that includes me, we used to disable focus because it looked ugly. But it's a feature that helps people with both vision and cognitive issues don't know to know where to click. And because it's a CSS element, it can be defined. So you can control what it looks like. Make sure you use alt attributes. I didn't put all the screenshots in because I didn't actually have a good sense of how long it would take me to do this presentation. But that's interesting. That was supposed to be a white box on the right-hand side. I got carried away. The idea with an alt attribute is it describes the image for someone who either can't see it or who maybe they can't see it because A, they're blind, or B, they have turned off images in their browser, which was much more popular back in the old days when we had 2400 baud modems, and it would take an hour for an image to display. You'd turn them off, and then the alt attribute would tell you what you were missing, and then you could decide if you wanted to see it and if you had time for the image to download. This is sort of a useless alt attribute because a file name doesn't tell me anything. What you're looking for is something that describes the image, that provides a visual picture in someone's head so that they know exactly what that image is. And it's going to depend a lot. Alt attributes are a little bit more complicated than just describe the image because it depends on the surrounding text. Decorative images never need alt attributes. They just need blank attributes, which means just the alt equals quote, quote. That's a blank attribute. Screen reader will just sort of bounce over it. If the text fully describes the image, you can actually get away with a more minimalistic alt attribute. The WebAIM website, webaim.org, has an excellent article on creating alt attributes for images. Some other issues to be aware of, link text. Do not, please, 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 do not use click here. Do not use more. You can quantify them. You can say, click here for more information on whatever the subject is I've been talking about. You can say more information on whatever the subject is I've been talking about. But screen readers have functionality that brings up, just the way they brought up a list of headings, you can bring up a list of links. And it's entirely useless to get a list of links that in a row say click here, click here, click here, click here. It doesn't tell anybody anything. So do make sure that you use good link text. Tables. Make sure you code your tables to provide information to screen readers. This includes things like key head, key body, key footer. You can use So again, WebAIM has excellent articles on how to format a table so that when we look at a table, when you can see a table, you know to read across the column and then go down one, and you can keep matching the information in the cell to the header so that you know exactly what the information relates to. Without the code that relays that same information through a screen reader, what they end up with is hearing all of the headers, and then all of the rows, and then all of the row, and then all of the row, which means that after like the fifth or sixth row, they actually have no idea usually what information goes with what header. By coding tables, you will be able to provide that information. And the same goes with forms. There's code that you can add to forms, and forms aren't used typically as much. We tend not to use as much form stuff, but if you're going to have a form, you want to make sure that somebody with a screen reader understands what information they're being asked for. And you want to do things like, if you've ever filled out a form where you say, you see at the top it says anything with an asterisk is required. Screen readers typically don't announce asterisks. They just skip over them. So red asterisk doesn't do anything for somebody using a screen reader because they don't know exactly what information is required. That Excel file I was talking to you about had loads of required things, required information cells, and I had to change every asterisk to say mandatory or required or something so that the screen reader would pick it up. So that's another thing you want to watch for. If you want more information, a whole bunch of places you can go. Numerous conferences. There's actually one going on right now, I believe, called the Accessibility Summit, which is a virtual conference. Knowbility runs a conference. XSU runs a conference. Big Design includes accessibility sessions. STC's been including accessibility sessions. And CSUN, which is a major conference held at the beginning of the year, it's the shorthand abbreviation. It's California State University at Northridge. The actual conference name is really long, given this conference has been going on for years and years and years, like 40, I think, 30, 40. They draw 8,000 people. They have well over 100 sessions, and every session is related to accessibility. And that takes place out in San Diego again in the spring. But there's also unconferences, and the website here, accessibilitycamp.org, lists all of the unconferences that the person in charge of that site is aware of. For example, the Boston event is being held September 28th. The DC event is being held October 12th. There's also usually one in Guelph in Canada. There's one in Toronto. I don't know if Montreal is holding theirs this year, and there's other cities where these are also being held. The benefit of what's typically called known as an unconference is these events are free. They are with sponsors that help provide the things that we need, like food and other accessibility things. All you have to do is just register and then show up. And it's just as much fun as a regular conference. Not everybody runs a true unconference. DC is always an unconference. People show up, people who want to speak put their name up on the board, and the schedule gets rearranged, but everybody who wants to speak does. In Boston, we do a mix. We actually make arrangements for some speakers. We put them on a schedule ahead of time, and that would be because I end up having speakers coming in from, I have speakers this year coming from New York City, from Florida, from Toronto, and from Montreal so far. I'm going to have a few others. And so this way they know they're going to speak because they do all this on their own dime. So this way they're set. And they have a tendency to use, I mean, I do the same thing when I speak at an unconference. If you know you're going to be speaking at some place like CSUN, you use the unconferences to do kind of a test to, fine-tune your thing, your presentation. You can also get information by setting up a custom search in Twitter. Look for hashtag A11Y. The 11, it means that there's 11 characters between the A and the Y, and that stands for accessibility. There's also specific accessibility tags depending on what you want. Each of the unconferences and conferences has their own A11Y hashtag of some kind. Like we use A11Y boss for our stuff. Do check out WCAG 2.0. which you can just put in Google. That's from the W3C. And these folks are the ones who make sure they're providing the standards to make sure that all of the web content is accessible. So they have guidelines. You can find the 4 principles for 4. You can find examples. You can find how to meet them. You can find what it requires. And then WebAIM is an awesome site. Lots and lots and lots of information on very specific things that you can do to create accessible content. And now we can open it for questions, because I talked faster than I thought.
Well, we have a little bit of time, so thank you. There's actually been a good bit of some tweeting on the accessibility tag about this webcast. Okay, so for those of you that have questions, drop them into the questions area. We have one here, Shar, who wants to know, what about designing for persons losing fine motor skills in their hands where using touch screens presents a problem?
Okay, excellent question. That is one where problems with their hands, which means they're going to have trouble using keyboard access as well, I assume. Boy, I have to think about that one. Designing for people, they can use, on a mobile phone, on Apple, you can use VoiceOver, and you can use Siri, because you can talk. And Android is now coming out with something very similar. And I'm trying to think of, they can use something if they're trying to create content. They can use Drag and Dictate, or something similar to that, where they talk to their computer and it takes their content in. Again, my mother, I know, everybody says don't use your mother for a reference, but my mother is 80-something years old and is trying to do stuff, and she bought herself a Windows 8 system and was having, obviously, major problems. And it turned out it was Mother's Day, and I said to her, why don't you turn on Narrator? And I told her how to use it. And Narrator in Windows 8, she was so excited. She said it was the best Mother's Day present ever, and I didn't think to do anything all that awesome. But because of it, she can now send emails very, very easily. Oh, maybe that's the sound of my computer. And that's really helped her out a lot without having to do something like spend money on Dragon. So she can see, so the person can see what exactly it is available on her or his system that will let them use their voice. Fine motor skills typically means problems with the mouse, and almost always means problems hitting specific menu items, because those are the hardest, especially when they use a lot of JavaScript or HTML to create those fancy drop-down menus where you have to come down and then over and then down and then over, and almost always somehow along the way it gets lost. So I would. Well,
I can't hit those, and as far as I know, I don't have any fine motor skill problems. So what about, you talked a little bit about how technical communicators already have a lot of these skills because they're used to writing sort of well-structured or, organized content that follows a template. But one of the things we hear a lot when we ask about accessibility requirements, people say, oh, yeah, we don't have to do that. And if you're in tech comm inside an organization and you start thinking about this, you might hear, well, why bother? What's the short version of the argument for why is this important? Why should we make the effort? And for the record, we usually just go off and do it without telling our customers.
The short reason is as much as 20% of your audience has some kind of a disability. Any given person over their lifetime will spend 11% of their lifetime with a disability, hidden or visual, that somebody else can recognize. It's the law. In the United States, we have Section 508, and we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, which, by the way, the DOJ is working on rewriting, which will make it applicable to all websites, not just those that are being used by the government. And to me, one of the most important things, it's just the right thing to do.
And what kinds of costs are you looking at to do it right?
The cost can vary depending on when you decide that you're going to start implementing accessibility. Saw a quote once, and I kept waiting for actual confirmation, which a lot of this information ends up being shared without good attribution. But basically it came down to if you make a change during development, it'll cost $25. If you make a change during QA, it'll cost $500. And if you make a change after it's been released, it'll cost $15,000. Then I started working on this Excel project, and what happened was they had created this very complex Excel spreadsheet with multiple tabs, loads of formulas, information passing back and forth, instructions in a separate PDF, which is really hard for somebody with a screen reader to use. And they decided not to attack ADA compliance until after the spreadsheet was completely done. All the colors were wrong because all the color contrasts were off. The font used a huge variety of font families and font sizes. And all the content from the PDF had to be incorporated into the Excel file so that people didn't have to bounce between the two. And I believe it cost them about $15,000. So all of a sudden it was like, ooh, I can actually say that number is pretty close to correct. Because when you do it after everything is done, it's a much higher cost because you basically have to redevelop. If you're using something based on a template, for example, if you're using WordPress or Drupal or Joomla, if you're using XML, you can make it so that the template, the transforms, the whatever, already include the basic accessibility features you need. You can make sure that the CSS is already set up with the appropriate color code. And because you're basing everything on templates, once it's set up, you don't have to touch it again unless you actually find a mistake. Then you only have to worry about the other finer stuff, link text, vocabulary, that sort of thing, all attributes. But the earlier in the cycle that you can start worrying about accessibility, the cheaper it will be.
So basically, if you bake it in up front, it doesn't really cost much of anything.
No, it just becomes another thing you do.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to add colors anyway. Just make sure they're compliant. Run them through a checker and make sure.
So another interesting question that's just popped up here, whether creating accessible content will also improve search engine optimization.
Absolutely. It's one of the benefits. When I did the session at STC called Writing for Everyone, basically what it addressed was the fact that if we do the things to improve our content, it helps with translation. It lowers the cost of translation. It improves search engine optimization. It makes it better for accessibility, and it makes it just better for everyone to use. Because even if you like to read, you just like to read, and it's easier to read things that are easy to read. For the heck of it, I picked up the Sherlock. I've been reading a lot lately, and I reread so many of my own books. I decided to put something different, and I'd read Sherlock Holmes books ages ago, and I kind of had to revamp my mind a little bit, because when you suddenly go from books written in this current decade to books written when the Sherlock Holmes books were written, all of a sudden the vocabulary is different, the language is different, and of course it's a British author. It was like, wow. So yes, you write accessibly. If you add in these some of these things I talked about, your search engine optimization will improve.
So you could, whatever minimal cost is there, you can just argue that, well, we need it for SEO, so it's worthwhile.
Right.
If you can't get it past people for things like, this is about to be legally required, which I find to be a compelling argument in general.
Yeah, in general, although I will tell you that most people who deal with accessibility stuff kind of hate that one being like first in the list. Like, yes, it's a requirement, but that makes it's sort of heavy-handed when you start with the legal part, whereas if you can start with the other stuff first, it's like, oh yeah, it is legal. There is a legal issue here, but you should be doing it because up to 20% of your audience you might be ignoring.
And it's okay. So I think that takes care of all the questions. And I want to thank you for coming and putting this all together. Again, we'll have the recording out shortly, we hope. Thank you to all of you for coming. If you have any other questions for me or for Shar, feel free to ping us via email or Twitter or whatever. I think we're pretty easy to find out there. And Shar, thank you for coming. And hopefully we will see you down the road at the next event.
Sounds good.
So thanks again. Bye, everybody.